Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Salerno, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining our Global Banking Workshop Series. Before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping items I'd like to go over. For today's session, your phone lines have been muted and will remain on mute throughout the session. Please use the chat function to submit any questions that you may have during the presentation or during the Q&A portion of the webinar. With that, we're going to get started, and I'd like to introduce the moderator of our first session, John McApinlack, who's Director of Business Development in the Global Banking team. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mike. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Chris Kuehl, Managing Director of Armada Corporate Intelligence. In his role, Chris provides forecasts and strategic guidance for a variety of corporate clients around the world, and is the chief economist for several national and international organizations. Prior to starting Armada in 1999, he was a professor of economics and finance for 15 years, teaching in the US, Hungary, Russia, Estonia, Singapore, and Taiwan. He holds advanced degrees in economics, Soviet studies, and East Asian studies. Chris is also the writer-editor of Business Intelligence Briefs and a writer for the Black Owl Report, both publications from Armada. He's an economic analyst for the Armada Strategic Intelligence System and is responsible for the Credit Managers Index from the National Association of Credit Management, as well as Fabonomics from the Financial Management Association. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand the reins over to Chris.
Very good. Thanks very much. And I will bring up my screen because as an economist, we're not allowed to talk without graphs and charts. So it's important that we have these. So I must apologize for the less than ideal broadcasting environment. I am currently at a trade show in Detroit, Forge Fair, which is basically comprised of people who make and supply the forging industry. So if you hear this tremendous crash every so often, it's probably one of the forge machines in action, and it's not the building falling apart. So I haven't heard one of those for a little bit, so we might escape that particular kind of ambiance. So with that, I'm going to get into discussion of the economy, kind of touching on what's happening both globally and in as far as the United States is concerned. And when I looked at the original title, I probably should have put a question mark at the end of that. Recovery this time for sure. We're not really that positive anymore. So as we get started, it's important to understand that people don't really understand bankers and don't understand what they do. The clients think that you're all some kind of a predatory fish. Your friends think you just throw money around. Society thinks you're just, out having expensive drinks and cigars. Your parents probably think you're something out of Wall Street. You think you're basically in the relationship building business. But what you really do is deal with mounds and mounds and mounds and mounds of paperwork. I noticed that you're going to be doing a session on understanding letters of credit, and my God. That's got to be one of the more complicated things about doing international business. So I'm glad you have a guide to get you through that. So as we get started looking at the last couple of years, we obviously have had a real roller coaster environment. 2020 was utterly miserable. 2021 was quite a bit more spectacular than we thought it would be. And by the time we get to 2022, we're probably dealing with what would begin to look like more normal behavior. Honestly, it's almost amazing that people are still listening to economists as much as we blow the last couple of years of predictions. In 2020, we did not really think it was going to be this bad. I remember doing programs early in the pandemic where we were very confidently talking about a May rebound, June at the latest. People weren't really being laid off. They were just being furloughed. The lockdown was only going to last a few weeks. Don't worry about it. We didn't know much about the pandemic. We didn't really know much about what the responses to the pandemic were going to be. We now know a lot more, and we realize that we really miscalculated on a lot of fronts. We were not the only ones. Every country in the world was going through a very similar kind of period. So then we get to the beginning of 2021, and we blew it again because we expected a recovery, which we got. but we expected it to be very slow. We expected it to be methodical, that consumers were going to take a while to get back to their old routine, and that it was going to give us time to adjust. We got no time to adjust. The consumers came out of the gate like they were on fire, and we literally in Q2 were growing at a rate we had not seen since the 1800s. We were growing at about 9.5% in the early part of Q2. We never grow that fast. That's China at its peak growth. By the end of second quarter, we had relaxed a bit. We were back down to about 6.5, but that's still twice what our normal growth rate was. So we had a lot more growth to deal with. Consumers were putting a tremendous amount of pressure on everything from the supply chain to the financial sector. And a lot of the supply chain issues that we've been dealing with lately really stem back to the beginning of this year, that the system just wasn't prepared for that kind of onslaught. It was such an odd recession. It was a one sector recession. It was hitting the service sector, really didn't affect manufacturing and the goods producing sector that much. Those were still growing, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. When we get into 2022, things start to kind of revert back to norm. We get more spending on services again. We get a little less spending on goods because of that. I mean, normally the US consumer spends 65% of their disposable income on services. If you're in the upper 20% of income earners, you spend 80% of your money on services. And those were suddenly cut off. We weren't traveling, we weren't going to restaurants, we weren't shopping particularly, at least at a lot of the retail outlets. What we were doing was accumulating goods. We were buying everything from inexpensive items, imports were way up, all the way to expensive items. There was a period in 2021 where it was impossible to buy an RV. They were gone throughout the country. Everybody had basically stripped out the supply. So we're still kind of coming to grips with two of the weirdest years that we've dealt with in decades, because honestly, you're not going to be able to compare much of anything to 2020 or 2021. Those are both going to be anomaly years. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. We've talked a little bit about some of this already. We have good GDP numbers. 6.5 was what we ended up with at the end of second quarter. Third quarter numbers came out this week. I think they came out today, and I have not had a chance to look at them, but they were being predicted to be as high as 5.5%. I think they came in lower than that. I will check that later today, but the estimate was that they were going to be close to 3.5 rather than 5.5. The rebound stalled a little, but now seems to be bouncing back. We saw a decline towards the end of summer, but it was a short-lived one, and we're now sort of coming back into the Christmas season. And then the service sector is still shaky, but beginning to pick up. Most of the indicators, though, are still very strong, and we'll talk about some of these as we go. But just one is an example that a lot of people pay attention to, particularly on the industrial side, Purchasing Managers Index. The PMI is produced predominantly by two organizations. One in the United States is the Institute for Supply Management, ISM, and then there's one that's done by IHS Markit, which is done for about 38 countries around the world. Both very similar methodology. The power of the PMI and others like it are that it's someone it's a survey, so it's current. A lot of economic data is slow to come out, and by the time you get it, you're really looking 2, 3, 4 months back instead of what's going on right now. The Purchasing Managers Index comes out once a month. It's a survey, and it's also an accurate one. A lot of surveys aren't as accurate as we would like them to be because people either don't answer particularly honestly or they don't have enough information to answer. My least favorite survey is the Consumer Confidence Survey because you'd get such bizarre responses. The consumer doesn't really know what's going on. So you say, are you feeling confident? Sure. We've discovered over the years that if you ask people if they're confident on a Monday, they are much less confident than when you ask them on a Friday. How unusual. So the Purchasing Managers Index, on the other hand, is quite reliable because you're asking a purchasing manager a simple question. Are you buying more or less or the same? So you ask a purchasing manager, you buy more or less steel? More. How come? I don't know. I don't even know what we make. Somebody told me to buy more steel and we're out of toilet paper. I'm the purchasing manager, man. I just buy what people tell me to buy. I'm trying to get a good price. So they don't influence the survey. That just is. They're either buying something or they're not. And the other power of the index is that it's easy to read. Anything over 50 is growth. Anything under 50 is contraction. We have been in the mid to upper 50s, even 60s throughout most of this year. So the PMI is still very strong. Industrial production numbers have been pretty decent, except for the automotive sector. And we've seen capacity utilization numbers fairly close to what they should be. I mean, just down the list, none of the indicators are really in desperation at this point. When it comes to the bad part, it's inflation. And the banks know all too well what the problem with inflation is. Recession is not universal. Some people do quite well during a recession. You know, there's a lot of recession-proof industries. Inflation affects everybody. Everybody's prices go up. We're sitting at right now an inflation level about above 5 to 5.5% at the real rate, and somewhere between 3.5 and 4% at core. It drives people nuts that economists make a distinction between these two. And the reason we do that is that we're trying to predict and trying to compare. We're trying to look at what inflation was last year compared to what it is this year, last quarter compared to this quarter. Therefore, we leave out volatile prices, things like food and fuel. The reality is you can't leave those prices out, so you're going to continue to see that inflation. But the core rate is what influences the Fed. The Fed is going to be responding to how close that core rate is to their comfort level. Right now, they would like it around 2 to 2.5% at most. So it's about 1.5 points higher than the Fed is comfortable with. And when that starts to settle in, that's when the Fed begins to look at interest rates. And the banks are going to be watching that closely. The challenge going forward is we don't know how permanent that inflation is. The Fed has referred to it as transitory, which in reality, it always is. I mean, inflation always goes up and down. The question is how fast, and is it going to go down anytime soon? Most of the inflation for the past year has been driven by commodities, and commodities are notoriously volatile, which we'll talk about in a minute, but you've seen that for years. Oil prices are up and down, metal prices are up and down. We watched lumber go to record levels this summer and then fall, you know, once the production caught up. So the question for the Fed is what's happening with wages, because once wages go up, they stay up, they're sticky. So if you start to see a lot of response to the labor shortage with higher wages, that becomes a more permanent part of inflation. The discussion among Fed officials was raising rates towards the end of next year, beginning of 23, but now you're seeing some conversation about raising them even sooner than that, maybe mid-year. A lot of it's going to depend on what happens with the members of the Open Market Committee. This year, the 4 regional Fed presidents that are part of that committee are either dovish or centrist when it comes to rates. But come January, that changes dramatically. And you end up with 2 of the most hawkish members of the Fed on the Open Market Committee, Esther George from Kansas City and Loretta Mester from Cleveland, both of whom have been pushing for higher interest rates for a long time. The other 2 members, we don't know for sure what their positions are. You've got Jim Bullard from St. Louis, who can sometimes be a hawk, sometimes a dove. And we're not sure who the Boston Fed representative is going to be because Eric Rosengren retired early. One of the interesting things about Bullard is that his former head of research, Chris Waller, is the newest member of the Fed's Board of Governors and has been consistently more hawkish than Bullard himself. So we'll see how that all plays out. Job seekers, we'll talk more about that in a minute, but workforce has been a big issue for the entire year. Frankly, it's been a big issue for a long time. Like I said, I'm on a manufacturing show now. And when you talk to manufacturers and say, hey, did you know that there's a labor shortage? They're like, really? Wow, we hadn't noticed that over the last 20 years. This is not a new phenomenon for them. It's not a new phenomenon for construction. It's not a new phenomenon for transportation. we're short 80,000 truck drivers right now. And that's going to be up to 160,000 short next year, simply because the average age of an over-the-road truck driver now is 60. It is not a young man's occupation, and these guys are retiring. Pace of vaccination has slowed, but we're somewhere between 60 and 65%, short of the goal of 80%, but not far off from other parts of the world. Europe is maybe at around 70%. The ugly part, even uglier than usual, supply chain issues are continuing to be front page. The chip shortage may not ease until sometime next spring, and it's not the only thing that's in short supply. Port congestion is a serious problem. The retailers are worried about the holiday season because a lot of their stuff is still stuck on ships or has been unloaded but isn't moving anywhere. There was the declaration by Biden to open up the ports 24/7, and that got the cargo off ships, but it only allowed it to stack up on the port. So it isn't moving anywhere. It's still in transit. There's just not enough trucks to move it to the distribution centers, not enough space in the distribution centers. I mean, it's a chain, and that chain is still fairly well disrupted. Like I said, labor shortage is still bad. There's 10.3 million jobs going unfilled, but the majority of these require skills, experience, and education that a lot of the applicants don't have. And this has been a problem for quite a long time. The other thing that we keep forgetting, because you see the press going on and on, people don't want to work and people are leaving and blah, blah, blah. Well, part of the problem is people are retiring, and they're retiring at a very rapid clip. 10,000 baby boomers reach retirement age every day. We've been losing 3.5 to 3.7 million people per year for the last several years, and we'll continue to see that pace for the next several years. The boomers have dominated the economy since they were born, and they still are. And until that wave kind of works through, you're losing a large amount of your working population no matter what you do. Major fault lines have developed globally. We're more and more in conflict with China than we are in cooperation with China. And it's not the only place that there's tension. You'll talk more today about what's going on with global trade, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I noticed one of the titles was, "Is globalization dead?" It's not, I don't think, but it is changing. And what we kind of accepted as routine is beginning to shift. Inflation is not as transitory as we originally thought it might be. Oil prices have been ramping up. Those will come back down at some point, but we don't know when. The big issue is wage inflation. So here's the part where I hope you all have short-term memory loss and don't remember this 2 weeks from now, and don't remind me of how many times I was wrong. So here's what we think is going to happen in 2022. GDP growth around this year will be around 5%, maybe a little higher, and getting back to more normal rates next year, but still high. I mean, if we're norm is 2.5 to 3, 4 to 4.5 is a pretty rapid clip. We would have been very happy with these growth rates a couple years back. Inflation at the core will probably stay a little higher than the Fed would like, closer to 3%. Real rate probably coming back to maybe 5%, but that will be variable. You know, you'll see some shifts as the year goes on. Interest rates probably rising by mid-2022. I don't think the Fed will hold off till the end of the year, but they'll do it slowly. Loretta Mester's group predicts that the rates would be somewhere around 1 to 1.5 by the end of the year. At least that's what their study showed. And we'll see. I mean, this is something they put together several months ago. Maybe we'll be revising it by the beginning of the year. All the other rates, of course, go up along with that Fed funds rate. Mortgage rates will start to rise. We don't yet know how that will affect the housing sector, but honestly, the mortgage rate has been the only thing that's been going right as far as housing. Prices are up and there's insecurity within the normal buying public, but the mortgage rates are so low that it still attracts people into the industry. Unemployment numbers are going to vary. They're tricky to even track, to be honest. We're not paying as much attention to workforce participation as we should, but we also don't even completely understand the data when it comes out monthly. We always look at the U3 level of unemployment, which is at around 4%. But U3 only counts people who are formally in the unemployment system, getting unemployment checks, using the unemployment offices, etc. U6, which is almost twice what U3 is, looks at the discouraged worker, the person who's out of work but not formally looking for a new job, and the involuntary part-time, the person who's looking for a full-time job, but the best they can do is a part-time job. Those are much larger numbers than they used to be. A lot of those U6 people are showing up in the so-called gig economy. They're looking for a full-time job, but in the meantime, they're doing Uber, or they're doing work off the books, or they're engaged and they're making money, but they're not doing it necessarily in the traditional formal economy. Trade deficit is likely to worsen because consumers are buying more, and that means more stuff from overseas. But the good news is that exports are still rising too. We're seeing an increase in agricultural exports by quite a bit, and the machinery exports have been growing as well. So the fact that we're importing a lot of stuff is kind of obscuring the fact that we're also exporting a lot of stuff. And then when it comes to the pandemic, it probably has one more surge left in it, just because we're going into the winter, and that tends to be the point when any of these things tend to get another foothold. So as we look into the coming year, it's the consumer that's going to lead the way, as the consumer led the way down. It's going to be their spending on goods and services. What's interesting about the prediction going forward is that we saw this dramatic recovery in service spending, but then it falls off as we get into next year and beyond, and goods producing activity continues to get stronger. You have seen kind of a shift in people's expectations, and they learned in the last couple of years to be a little more goods oriented. Some people are describing it as consumer self-sufficient. They're not eating out as much, they're not traveling as much. Now maybe that all comes back, a lot of it has, but it's predicted to kind of level off, and that services kind of loses its oomph for a little bit. I mean, frankly, we've always bought a lot of goods, and services have always been a close kind of comparison to overall spending, and it depends on age and it depends on parts of the country. It's a very kind of variable measurement. We've seen the contributions to GDP growth being predominantly personal consumption expenditures, as would make sense. The government role was pretty dramatic in 2008, 2009, also played a pretty significant role in 2020. That begins to fade. If you look at the expectations going forward, GDP numbers very high right now as we recover, but kind of settling down when we get into next year. Again, respectable, they're not awful. These are numbers that are very reminiscent of what they've been in the past, but you're definitely getting a little bit of I almost like people are catching their breath. They went crazy in 2021 trying to make up for what they didn't do in 2020. Now they start to get a little more normal, whatever that is these days. Record farm exports, I mentioned that earlier. Our export numbers are looking good, and the export activity as far as agriculture should be very good this year, simply because other countries have not had as good a year as we have had. The rain came when it was supposed to, and the harvests are expected to be good. The big challenge with farm exports this year is going to be transportation. And this is not just getting it out of the fields, it's getting it to its intended overseas audience. Like, for example, opening up the ports. This was a gesture to kind of get the supply chain going, and it was like, okay, let's get these ships unloaded so they can get the heck out of here and go. Well, they're not going back home because they can't load. The ports are still so clogged that there's no way to get the product onto the ships to go back to Asia or wherever they came from. That's largely agricultural. And so the ag companies are like, well, we've produced a lot, we're ready to sell it, but now we can't get it on the ship because the ship can't dock, and the ships aren't leaving because they don't want to go back empty. So it's still a clogged mess. Even though the ports have now been opened on a more consistent basis, it really hasn't unlocked the logjam as yet. If you look at housing and construction in general, the housing market's beginning to taper a bit, but it's been very high and it continues to stay high. Mortgage rate changes will affect that. Non-residential construction still trying to kind of find its new location. It's certainly not getting a lot of office building development until we start going back to work on a regular basis, and we might not. I mean, right now, we're not seeing a stampede back to the normal work environment. The two fastest growing parts of non-residential would be warehouse and distribution centers, and interestingly enough, manufacturing. And we'll talk a little bit more about manufacturing in a minute. But what's intriguing about the manufacturing construction is that the manufacturers are building new facilities in order to accommodate their robotic automation based transition. You could put your workers in some nasty cinder block building with bad ventilation and not, and they just sucked it up and worked. The robots and the computers are like, nope, I'm sorry, it's dirty and it's hot and it's humid and I'm not going to work. So they're literally having to upgrade their facilities to accommodate their robots. The workers are like, really? I worked in this horrible building for 20 years and you could care less, but as soon as the robot threw a fit, now you're going to fix it all up. So it's just kind of ironic that computers and robots are pickier than we are. I mentioned that the commodities prices have been all over the place. Steel scrap prices that peaks, it falls, it peaks again, it falls again. The scrap is tricky because it is a harvested resource. It's not a produced resource. We mostly get it from old buildings, from vehicles, cars, and the like. Most of the world's scrap comes from ships, but we don't do much ship scrapping because there's environmental concerns, so we leave it to other countries to do. It's kind of ironic that when we scrap US warships, we scrap them in China, and China uses those warships for their steel business, not ours. So we're literally supplying former naval vessels to China to be scrapped into Chinese steel, which is kind of weird. Same thing with structural steel. You get price surges followed by price collapses. It's all basically driven by demand. And right now, demand is very high. I'm at a conference today that is predominantly dealing with the forging industry, and they're very sensitive to steel prices, and steel prices have gone up. But they've seen this before. And what's predominantly worrying them is their clients that they sell into are largely automotive, the heavy machinery, the Caterpillars of the world, et cetera, those that need large forged products. And the volatility in the market is not new to them, but right now it's certainly hurting them. Oil prices have come back up and will probably stay relatively high, at least for the time being, simply because of what's going on in Europe. And this is an example of a very integrated market. We know it is, we watched it for years, but the challenge at the moment is that it's not really the US consumption that's affecting oil prices. It's the fact that there's been a natural gas crisis in Europe, which has driven the price of natural gas up by as much as 500%. That has been predominantly because the Russians are not shipping as much gas as they are expected to. The Europeans are dragging their feet on building a new pipeline, which the Russians do not like, and the Russians are putting pressure on Europe to finish and give approval to that pipeline by withholding gas, which has suddenly made the price very expensive. At the same time, Europe had invested a lot of money in wind power, and this is the year that the wind did not blow in Europe, and you're getting about 20% of what you were supposed to get from those wind farms. That has forced them to buy more natural gas as well. That translates to the US because we're now selling LNG both to the Europeans and the Asians at a higher price. And that is causing US utilities to turn away from natural gas to use oil again. And that drives up the price of oil. So the American goes to the pump and says, oh my God, it's gotten expensive and what's going on? And it's like, well, it's because the wind is not blowing in Europe and because the Russians are being Russians and because the utility, it's like, it's a very integrated world. The upshot of this is that when you start to see demand decline, or if the Russians begin to increase their productivity towards Europe, these prices could come back down again. The oil majors would rather not see them get way up past 80 and 90 because that draws in too many competitors. So it's probably going to stay in that 80 to 90 range, not much higher. But when it comes down, good question. I mean, this could be something affecting the market until early spring, and that's when oil and gas consumption tend to go up anyway as we get into the summer driving season. So bottom line is anybody who tries to predict oil prices is basically taking on one of the most thankless tasks known to man. I mentioned that people were not going back to their offices at quite the rate we thought they might. There has been a significant amount of return, depends on the part of the country. Texas has been up around 50%. California has been around 20%. The estimates are still that around 80% of people will be back in their offices by the middle of next year. But we don't know that for sure because the employee now has a lot more leverage simply because of the worker shortage. And we're still trying to figure out what exactly the worker is going to do with that leverage. Is it going to be ask for more money? Is it going to be asking for more benefits? And one of the things that's high on a lot of lists is I want to keep that flexibility. I want to continue to work from home. Bear in mind that part of the job shortage situation is that 7 million women have not been able to get back into the workforce because they're still dealing with their children. The schools are open again, kind of, but a friend of mine says, well, here's the deal. The schools are open, but what they don't tell you is that if one of your classmates, one of your kids' classmates comes down with COVID and has to be quarantined, well, then your kid gets quarantined too. So she said, yeah, I was back to work for about 2 weeks until the school informed me that my kid was going to be quarantined at home. What do I do now? I go to the boss and say, hey, I got to go back virtual again, or I got to quit again. And for a lot of women, they don't have that option. So you are still missing about 7 million who are traditionally in the workforce, but have not been able to get back in. So we all know how nasty the supply chain mess has been. This is kind of the perfect trifecta of problems. Everything from transportation itself to warehousing to inventory levels, all hitting highs we've not seen in decades. I mean, even going back to 2008. The capacity situation is serious. There are 7.5 loads, twice as high as we saw in 2019. These are record numbers. 7.5 loads for every truck on the road. And we're dealing with driver shortages and truck shortages and train shortages and plane shortages. I mean, everything you can think of. A lot of air cargo has been affected because a lot of it was carried in the belly of commercial flights, all of which have been cut. So every time you see an airline reducing the number of flights, well, it's also reducing cargo capacity. The driver shortage has created all kinds of interesting responses. A lot of the recruiting of new drivers has been coming from the old Slavic areas, a lot of Russians and Poles and Serbo-Croats and others coming in to take truck driving jobs, to the point that it's even changing how the industry relates. I was talking to the Used Truck Association, and they were talking about the number of translators they were having to hire to deal with the number of drivers from Eastern Europe. And about a week after that talk, I'm in a truck stop and there's a bunch of Russian drivers. And so I'm all excited. I'm a former Soviet studies guy. I learned Russian. So, oh boy, I can actually use my language again. And was saying, so you guys are drivers. Duh. So how come so many Russian truck drivers? And the guy said, well, we are Russian. We have Russian wives. We want to be on the road as much as possible. So you've got this entire shift taking place within an industry, and it just trickles down. It has all kinds of implications for big trucking companies, smaller trucking companies. It becomes very difficult for people to even predict when they're going to get a product, assuming that they've gotten it into the country in the first place. This is a little bit of an eye chart, and I just want to call attention to 2022 second quarter solid green line. This is something my company does. We do an industrial production study. We look at the data that's released around all these different industrial areas and work data, logarithms and algorithms that give us predictive ability several months into the future. Our reliability has been around 96, 97%. So those of you who just love to go around with data charts and impress people, this thing is 35 pages long, and we do a breakdown of all these different industrial areas. So feel free to send me an email. I will send you a copy of this, and you can go around to your friends and say, I have the ultimate cure for insomnia. Just look at this thing. The point that we're making is that the first couple of quarters of next year will be good growth quarters, and then things begin to settle down. Not for all sectors. I mean, you're looking at continued investment in the computer area, continued investment in fab metals, continued investment in the primary metals. Things like electrical begin to slow down. Things like aerospace slow down. So you're seeing kind of a good beginning of the year, and then it begins to taper just a bit. You see it a little more obviously with the line graph. So you get a good start to the year, it dips, but the good news is it comes back. So towards the end of 2020, you start to see that recovery a little more pronounced as we get further down the track. So that dip got a little shallower in the very latest version of this, and the recovery may be put off a little further, a little more obvious looking at it over a long-term period. So instead of getting one dip, we're getting a little bit of a two-dip experience, still keeping the numbers about where they were around 2019. This is another index similar to the Purchasing Managers Index. I do this for the National Association for Credit Management. Same principle as the PMI. So anything over 50 is good, anything under 50 is not. The trick with credit managers is that they tend to think into the future. They are not concerned about what your company is doing today. They're concerned about what it's going to be doing 30, 60, 90, 120 days from now because they gave you terms. So it tends to be a fairly future-oriented index. We separate it into two categories, favorables and unfavorables. The favorables from a credit manager's perspective, sales, dollar collections, number of applications for new credit, and amount of credit extended. All of those have been in the 60s and even 70s. I just got the latest version yesterday, and sales in the 70s and amount of credit extended in the 70s. The non-favorables from a credit manager's perspective, bankruptcies, disputes, accounts out for collection, slow pays, customer deductions, those are still predominantly in the 50s, but only barely. They're at like 50.1 or 51 or 52. So they're sort of hugging that line between decline and expansion. So again, this is one of those charts that if you want to impress your friends with your vast collection of arcane economic data, send me an email. I'll send you a copy of the CMI because we also do a further breakdown, a manufacturing sector, a services sector, which parallel the combined sector but are a little different in some significant areas. So I'm going to end this all with a little bit of good news, and then we'll take some time for questions. And if you don't have questions, then I'll come up with something else that's of just utterly fascinating value. The thing that has really started to change because of all the supply chain mess is a real interest in reshoring more than we've seen in the past. This has been discussed for a long time. Everybody keeps saying, how do we bring companies back to the US? Why did they leave in the first place? Well, they left for fairly obvious reasons. They went to see lower production costs, lower wages, and were able to produce overseas. And were able to do that because the transportation system and the just-in-time and all the stuff that wraps around it, they could rely on. So if they were sourcing from China or India or anywhere else, they didn't have to worry about that product getting to them. There was a supply chain that functioned. Now the supply chain is in crisis. And companies are like, why are we producing in China when we can't even get the stuff? So companies are now talking about moving it back to the US. Estimate is that about $1 trillion will shift back to US markets in the coming year. How much of that, we don't know. I mean, people could just be expressing their frustration with the current supply chain and talking big and not really planning to do it for real. But I've been at about a half a dozen manufacturing trade shows in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I've been asking these companies point blank, are you producing in China? Are you thinking of putting it back in the US? I have been astonished at about 75 to 80% of like, not only are we talking about it, we're actually doing it. We may not be moving everything out of foreign sourcing, but we're moving a lot of it. Our customers don't have patience for things that are being held up in the supply chain. We don't like the lack of control. So you're looking at 46% looking at relocating either or both manufacturing and sourcing. 37% looking at the United States. And when you look at this, 69% saying that they're likely, very likely, or extremely likely to reshore in the future. It's not that they're going to reshore everything. And there are 3 criteria, more or less, for a company that's going to reshore. Number one, does it have a heavy reliance on robotics and automation? If they are still labor intensive, it's very difficult to move back to the US. The labor rates are just too different. But if you're doing it mostly robotically, and if you're using automation and technology, you're competitive with any company in the world, regardless of what their labor rates are. Number 2 is kind of customer demand. Do you have a customer that just is not patient and is basically a good example? I was talking to a guy that produces parts for Toyota and produces them for the Toyota operations in the United States. And at one point, he was thinking about moving some of his operation overseas. He's out of Mississippi. And he said, well, I decided not to because I'm a small manufacturer that makes one specific thing for Toyota. And Toyota has the one strike and you're out policy. You miss one deadline one time, they're done. You've lost your contract. You've lost the opportunity to work with Toyota. He said, look, I'm the only employer in my whole county. If I go out of business, the whole county goes down. I can't afford the risk. I have got to be as close as I possibly can to the plant that I supply. And I'm not going to risk it by trying to go and save a few pennies by moving overseas. A lot of companies now are responding because that's what their consumer demands. And then the third is basically having the resources and the support to reshore in the first place. Was talking to some local bankers out of Nebraska, and they were talking about how the most common question they've gotten in the last 2 or 3 months is, how do I reshore? How do I bring stuff back? What can you do to help me reestablish an operation in and around Nebraska? So that's kind of the good news down the road, is that we're beginning to see some of the business that we lost over the last 20, 25 years starting to come back. So with that, I'm going to hush. I don't know how exactly we're going to handle questions. I could not resist this picture. I have 5 cats, so I can relate. And so here's the cat surrounded by other people's fish. So you're working in a bank and it's like, God, there's money everywhere, but it's not mine. So I can't have it. Are there any questions before I turn you over to your next speaker, who's probably going to be a lot more pragmatic than me?
Thanks, Chris. I have a few questions that have come in, so I'll go ahead and ask them. A lot of them you answered towards the end, but this question that came in is, do you expect the domestic housing market to continue to be strong in 2022?
It will be fairly strong, but it will not have that sort of intensity that it's had the last couple of years. The thing that was driving the housing market, despite high prices and all the rest, was that the mortgage rates were very low. And you were seeing people moving out of congested areas because they were kind of reacting to the shutdown and the protocols that surrounded the pandemic. Also, the millennial getting involved in the housing market for the first time. So those 3 things are still intact so far, but the mortgage rates are likely to start going up, not dramatically overnight, but they'll start being a factor. You've probably gotten about as much of the migration out of cities as you're going to get, because the pandemic fear has faded to a degree. People are now a little more comfortable just kind of going back to their old routine. And the millennial has been back in the market long enough that it's not this sudden surge. You know, there's still a lot of demand as far as the millennial is concerned, but they're not brand new to the market. And you're also seeing kind of an impact of the baby boomer finally leaving the scene. I mean, we're trying desperately not to die, but it's happening anyway. And so the existing home market has continued to swell. People I talk to in real estate say that next year is beginning to be a little less of a seller's market, a little more of a buyer's market. So the ability to sort of put your house out there and get 27 bids in the first half hour may start to fade. The good news is that even with a little bit higher mortgage rates, the new home buyer may see better bargains. And again, talking to people in the mortgage industry, they said, yeah, the bad news is the mortgage rates go up, but the good news is when they go up, we're in a better position to make loans because we have more margin to work with. So I think the market will still be sound, but it'll be like it always is. It's going to be on fire in Austin and Nashville, maybe slower in Fargo.
Another question that popped up was, what are your thoughts on the possibility of $4 a gallon gas? I'm assuming that's nationally, and how it will impact the consumer demand and purchaser sentiment?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get to that level. The primary reason is that when the prices get up to the $80 level where they are now, our own oil producers go into high gear. We've been watching OPEC and they're still being kind of reluctant to step up production. But I'll tell you what, the fracking operations in the Dakotas and Texas are like, yeah, with prices this high, we're having a good time and we can make money at 40 or $50 a barrel. You can imagine what we're doing at 80. And it's starting up a fracking operation is quick. I mean, some of the more traditional oil stuff, it takes months. The frackers can set these things up in a matter of weeks, and they will feed that need. We used to be very dependent on foreign crude oil. 2006, we required foreign oil for 65% of our needs. We don't require any of it now. We only do it out of convenience. The East Coast refineries still buy oil from the Middle East because it's cheaper than getting it from the Midwest, but we now produce everything we need. So I don't think we're going to see $4 a gallon. Now, having said that, if you get something like a hurricane that slams through the Gulf of Mexico and shuts down all the platforms, or if you get another war in the Middle East that panics people, it's a market-driven price. But barring that, we're also going into the time of year where we don't drive as much. So we've probably come pretty close to peak per gallon price at this stage. Now we can start to look for it, maybe to start tapering at first of the year.
Okay. Okay, another one that came up was, what are your current views on the future impacts of the Biden administration's current policies? I'm assuming this is in regards to the global economic growth.
Yeah, I think, they're kind of all over the place, as is often the case with politics. The thing that has been capturing the most attention is the whole infrastructure thing. And it's kind of two halves. I mean, there's the traditional infrastructure, which used to be a no-brainer, and Congress would pass that pretty automatically. But that's now a little bit in discussion. I think that part will eventually come across about the way it's planned. But it doesn't have the big economic impact that it used to because it's mostly repair. It's not really doing anything new. Back in the day, you'd have new highways, new seaports, new airports. Now it's just trying to bring the system back up to norm, which will be economically useful, but not a big boost. The human infrastructure part is where a lot of the controversy is because some of that could be very stimulative, some of it maybe not so much, but there's still big questions. Like, for example, free community college. Okay, it sounds good, but it's like free community college to do what? Like I said, I'm at a manufacturing show. The manufacturers were saying if you were putting students in the community college to learn to be in the manufacturing business, man, what a good idea. We definitely need that pipeline. If they're going to community college to major in underwater basket weaving, no. I mean, we don't need those people at all. We don't have jobs for them now. I mean, last year, honest to God, we graduated 10,000 people with advanced degrees in film criticism. Well, most of those people will end up working as a barista at Starbucks. I mean, there's a point at which you want to direct people a little. The biggest question with all of this money is the debt. I mean, right now we're spending $400 billion a year in debt service. That's the biggest drawback of having a debt this large. If it makes you feel any better, the Chinese debt to GDP is 280%. We're at 110, so we're not as indebted as China is, but it's still, opportunity cost. We blow 400 billion a year before the day even starts paying off the debt that we already have.
Okay. Looks like we have room or time for one more question. This one came up in regards to what region globally do you feel is best positioned to recover from the current supply chain issues?
It's probably going to be either North America or Europe, and that's only because we've got a better infrastructure to deal with the supply chain crisis. It's going to come down to clearing bottlenecks. I mean, the producers have more or less kept up. They're trying to figure out how to meet that consumer demand. It's just gotten clogged. So it's going to be who has the ability to clear out the ports, find ways to start transferring this stuff. And there's frantic activity to build. Give you one example, and we'll leave it at that. The big news for the middle of the United States is that Canadian Pacific is buying Kansas City Southern Railroad. Kansas City Southern is the smallest of the class ones, but it has the best penetration into Mexico. What Canadian Pacific wants to do is shift as much as 40% of the freight that's currently coming into the West Coast to the middle of the United States. So it would be railed across Canada from the Port of Vancouver, railed across Mexico through Lázaro Cárdenas, and ending up doing the break bulk and distribution in the middle of the US. That shifts the whole supply chain from the California coast to the middle of the US. The predictions are as many as 800,000 additional containers a day coming into the middle of the country. That ends up clearing the supply chain in some pretty significant ways, assuming that the infrastructure in the Midwest can keep up. And right now, there's a lot of attention to doing exactly. I mean, the two biggest rail yards in the US are Kansas City and Chicago already, and they're likely to become even larger. So I think we'll recover pretty quickly. The Europeans will recover pretty quickly. The developed countries in Asia will recover pretty quickly. We're going to see a real gap between the developed countries and the emerging market nations because they're still, we're at 65% vaccination. They're at 5% vaccination.
All right. And you have Dr. Kuehl's email address. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask him, I'm assuming you'd be willing to answer some of those questions.
Absolutely.
As well.
I am just as long-winded in print as I am in public. So feel free to send me questions.
Sounds great. Well, we want to thank you again, Chris, for your insight on what certainly continues to be times of uncertainty. And again, this session is being recorded. So for those of you that want to access Dr. Kuehl's session at a future date, we'll be happy to provide that to you.